Today we're in part 2 of a series, and I am excited about it. It's great. And we're calling it David, and we're studying the life of a guy who would eventually become King David, perhaps ancient Israel's greatest king. And so we jump into his story again today. And we're going to be reminded somewhat that it's really relevant to all of us, the story about him, either in this moment, in this season in your life, or it will certainly be relative. This story that we're about to talk about, it probably will be relative at some point, if not now, or in the future maybe, all right? I mean, don't you want something that's going to apply to your life? You don't want me to just come up here, give you a history lesson and tell you go. You want something that can stick to the ribs, as I put it, right? So here's what we're going to discover, and it's in your notes. We tilted this so it doesn't glare as much. It still might, but I don't know what else to do. Okay. Is that the ways of God are most unappealing and seemingly irrelevant when we are angry, isolated, or afraid. The ways of God. Now, if you're a Christian, then this is the God of the New Testament. If you're not a Christian, maybe you have some other concept of God, or maybe you're just a theist in general. But however you define that, the ways of God, however you see that, they are most unappealing, and they seem the most irrelevant, and you're going to see what I'm getting at. It just seems like, why would anybody even do this? Why would even anybody think this way when we're super angry, or when we feel incredibly isolated, or when we're lonely, or when we're afraid? These three conditions, they're killer conditions. And we've all discovered this, that these three conditions have the potential to undermine the resolve of even the most dedicated, devout, disciplined person among us. All right? Jesus is the rock. I'm not. Right? It's a journey we take with him. So, that is the three conditions that have the potential to cause us to literally crash through every moral and every ethical boundary that we've set for ourselves. Guardrails, if you will. You know, that these conditions, these three conditions, they have the potential to drive us beyond those guardrails that we've set up for ourselves relationally, physically, financially, or even professionally. They could mess you over. And one of these three, perhaps even maybe a combination of these three, are part of, ready, personally, your biggest regret. What? Yeah. If you were to stand up here and say, I want to tell you about the biggest regret in my life, chances are it was a time in your life when you are super angry and you did something you regret. Or you were isolated and you thought you were alone. Or perhaps you were just incredibly afraid. And unfortunately, one of these will probably be part of your life in the future. And part of your future regret as well. And the reason is this, that when we're under one of those three conditions, when we're overwhelmed with emotions, anyone ever been there? Oh, I'm so fortunate to be in a room with so many perfect people. You know, when those emotions associated with any of those conditions, we feel compelled to do what? To do something, right? You just got to do something. There's almost this sense of panic. I've got to do something to relieve this tension. In fact, you will do just about anything. Oftentimes, we do the wrong thing, and we rely on our instinct. And boy, is that a stupid thing to do, isn't it? Isn't it? Anyone here do something stupid? Don't point. We all did. And when was the last time that happened? Or when do we feel like it ever worked before? Or what just, as we would say, it just came natural. Natural's a mess. It is. And as a result of that, things don't get better. Things generally get worse. And there's not less regret, right? Things aren't less complicated. We make our own lives complicated. We end up angrier, we end up lonelier, and we end up scareder. Write it down. Now to the story of David. David had two colossal failures in his life. Two colossal failures. Ooh, that was tricky dick there for a moment, wasn't it? He is Very famous for what happened to him in his 50s once he had become king. All right? But the one we're going to talk about happens when he's in his 20s. He was only 20. Well, by this time he was about 22 years old. And this colossal mess that he's not famous for, but I think it's one of the most interesting, one of the most dramatic stories in all the Bible, certainly in all of the Old Testament. All right? And it's following the death of Goliath. Remember, following his defeat of Goliath. And if you were here last week, or if you didn't hear last week's message, you should go online, you should get caught up. But to get caught up, last week we followed him into the valley of Elah, where he faced Goliath. And after he kills Goliath, he becomes the most famous person in Israel. He was 15 years old, and everybody knows the 15-year-old's name. They're writing songs about David. He becomes legend. The king realizes, the king, not him, but the king realized, hey, that young man, he's got a lot of potential. But suddenly, and suddenly he also has a lot of influence and a lot of power. And King Saul, that was Israel's first king. He was incredibly, extraordinarily insecure, King Saul. He was a mess. King Saul came with a plan. It was a great plan. It might have been a good plan, though, if David wasn't who David was. Because, see, he decided to get David into his family so he could control him. Do you get that? So he offers him one of his daughters, David, in marriage. Right? And David's response, it's really kind of interesting. He said, I'm not worthy, okay? I'm not worthy to be the king of the son-in-law. And my family's not famous, and it's not rich family, so I don't think I'm worthy. And then there was the fact, hey, I'm only 15 years old. I just want to ride my bike. I don't think David said that, but that's, okay? I don't know if that even factored in. But David refuses the king's offer to be the son-in-law of the king. And the people are like, whoa, gosh. This kid, he's absolutely, who would refuse what a humble kid. Well, as time goes by, Saul is continuing to look for ways to control David because he's insecure and he needs to get a handle on this kid. Too much power, too much influence. They're singing songs about him. We don't like that. So David actually falls in love with another of King Saul's daughter named Michal. Or Michal. Okay? It's a girl's name back then. You can get away with it. And they got married. Then he becomes friends with King Saul's son, Jonathan. So now check this out. David's married the daughter, and he becomes friends with King Saul's son, Jonathan. And the next thing you know, King Saul realizes that this kid, getting him into the family, was actually a bad idea. Because he's so powerful and he's so everybody loves David. They made a sitcom about it in the 80s. Okay, Raymond. All right. Everybody loved David. And King Saul, he was very, very jealous of you. You have to remember something. That jealousy is a sin, right? But I used to teach children about stuff. I was a children's pastor. And we always called jealousy or covetousness or whatever you want to call it, the Siamese sin. What do I mean by that? Jealousy or covetousness, jealousy always has another sin that goes connected with it. Either it's lying, killing, stealing, hatred. No one's just jealous on their own. All right? Well, time goes by, actually about 7 years. And throughout the 7 years, King David is in King Saul's favor, and then he's out of King Saul's favor, then he's in King Saul's favor, then he's out of... You understand, some of you have in-laws. You understand what that means. All right? On one occasion, maybe actually more than one occasion, to be honest with you, King Saul, he decides, I got to get rid of this kid, and I don't care how I'm going to do it. I'm just going to do it. So I'm going to let the Philistines, that was their arch-rival enemy, the Philistines. They were bad guys. All right? So he sends David on these impossible missions, or mission impossible. Anyway, so he sends David to these impossible missions, and David would come back alive, and he'd come back successful. And then the people, of course, would love him even more, right? So this escalated to the point that King Saul, he's going crazy over this. And he discovers that every time he tries to have David secretly arrested, that his own son, Jonathan, remember that name, I mentioned it, or his own daughter, who married David, they assist him. And he continues to slip between King Saul's fingers. And the frustration, it builds. And finally, it all culminates into one night at dinner. Now, dinner. How many of you love dinner? Don't you love dinner? Isn't dinner great? Fried chicken, potatoes. Don't you love dinner? I love dinner. I think we should have dinner. Love dinner. Oh, the story. So, now dinner with the king was a big deal. Dinner with the king was the big deal of the day in ancient times. So if you sat at the king's table, it was an extraordinary honor to sit at dinner. Fried chicken with the king is a good thing. And David, typically he had shown up for dinner, but during these last few turbulent years, David kept missing dinner. And every once in a while, King Saul would turn to Jonathan, his son, David's friend. And Jonathan would cover for him. And Jonathan would cover for him. Well, I think he's out doing this, or I think he's out doing that. So finally, one night, the whole family gathered, and it's a big deal. Remember, I said the whole family. David's in the family, because he's married into it now. And King Saul loses it. He explodes. And here's what he tells us. This is what the text is. Now, get ready for this. This is one of those verses that makes me think maybe we shouldn't give children a Bible. Anyway, he says this. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan at this dinner, the whole thing, family sitting there, and this is what he said to him. You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, you. Isn't that great? Huh? I think that's pretty strong. Oh, and then pass the potatoes. No, it doesn't work that way. And when I'm reading this, do you know my first thought was, I really hope that the perverse and rebellious woman wasn't sitting at the table. Because then everybody's in trouble. How strange would that be? You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, you. I don't know, or I don't know what's going on, but I do know this. Don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse? So Saul's like, I've had it. I'm tired of pretending. I know that everybody at this table has sided with that shepherd boy against me, the king. The son of Jesse, to your own shame. And to the shame. Where is she here? Where is she? Mother, is the mother here? The mother that bore you? And you just can't leave her out of the equation. I think probably there was some marriage issues there. Anyway. Back in these days, there was always marriage issues. I think there was. You know why? Because they had too many marriages. They had favorite wives. Can you imagine that? You don't want to live in a culture where you have a favorite wife. Right? Anyway, that's another story for another day. It'd be a great story, wouldn't it? Anyway, it goes on like this. As long as the son of Jesse lives on earth, this was going to be a real issue. Neither you nor your kingdom. Because he saw Jonathan as the next king. He really did. And Saul is the first king of Israel. And he sees his son Jonathan to be the next king. And he wants his legacy to last. And he sees his family as part of the future of Israel. Neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to me. Send someone to bring him to me, because he must die. Go get him. Sick him. And then he storms out of the room. And Jonathan, he goes off and he finds David. And he says, David, you got to leave town. In fact, it's worse than that. You got to leave the country, because my father's not going to rest until you are room temperature. You understand? Until you die. He's too threatened by your reputation. He's too threatened by your influence on this particular nation. And David was only 22 years old, and suddenly he's afraid for his life. He's alone. He's rejected by the man that he risked his life over and over again. And he feels rejected by the nation that he's risked his life over and over. And in this particular case, he'd done nothing wrong. So he's abandoned. He's angry. He's afraid. The deadly three. And he did what many of us would do if we were abandoned, angry, and afraid. He panicked. He panicked. And he decided to take matters into his own hands. And he lost sight of something that's hard for us to even imagine. He lost sight of the fact that God was with him. Someone say amen. Amen. Okay, good, because it's going to come back and haunt you, that amen. It's going to be great. Because when you read these stories, when you read these narratives, we're like 30,000 feet above, and we can see how the story ends. And we're like, why would you do that, David the stupid? Why would you make the decision like that? Why would you panic? Why would you run? Why would you abandon your morals? Why would you abandon your ethics? And we can't help that there are people right now, who are watching you right now. And you know what they're doing? You pay attention, folks? There are people around you watching you, and they're wondering the same thing. There are people who are watching us struggle with some of the same things and wondering this. Why? Why would you do that? That's what they're wondering. Why are you taking that road? So let's be honest. You can look back at a season of your life. Think right now. Go back to a season of your life. Now that you have some time and you have some context and you ask yourself, why would I do that? Why would I go there? Why would I call him back? Why would you say yes to that invitation? Why did I spend that money? Why did I borrow that money to spend? Why don't I just get up and move? Why don't I just run away? And what was going on was real simple. And you feel abandoned, angry, and afraid. And our natural inclination is to panic. And that's what David did. He panicked. So here's what happened. The text tells us that David went to Nob, N-O-B. And Ahimelech, that's the priest, the high priest. Now I need to explain this just for a minute. At this time in history, Israel did not own that region around the city of Jerusalem. All right? The city of Jerusalem was not part of Israel at that time. So there wasn't really a capital city of the country. So what happened was the epicenter of the country was where the Jewish worship was, wherever that tabernacle was, and where the Ark of the Covenant was. And the Ark of the Covenant, or the tabernacle, it'd be moved around from city to city to city to the safest place to be within the territory of Israel. It didn't have a capital. So if it's over there, there's the hot spot. If it's over there, that's where it's strong, right? That's the way it worked. And at this particular time, it was in a city called Nob, because the tabernacle was there. The priests were there. And Ahimelech, though, he was the high priest at the time. So Ahimelech, when David shows up, this is what happened. Ahimelech trembled when he met him. And he asked David, he's asking David, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? Because understand, every time David showed up, you heard him coming before he got there. Because David traveled with 1,000 warriors, personal warriors. And Ahimelech, he'd never seen David by himself. And suddenly David shows up by himself. I want you to get this story. It's so cool. So he shows up and he's a little nervous and a little disheveled. And he sees him by himself. And Elimelech's looking at him and he says, okay, what's going on? And David answered Ahimelech, and he lies. He lies. Now, David lies. I think David is a guy that's against lying. I mean, that's one of the top 10 thou shalt nots, isn't it? You know, you fill in the blank. Thou shalt not. Yeah, he knows this. This is his law. In fact, get this, David at this particular time could walk over to the Ark of the Covenant, and supposedly it housed the original 10 Commandments, and he's in the presence of the original version of thou shalt not lie, because he's a Jewish man. He's a man who loves God, and he writes about God, and he's against lying, but David lies. Why is he lying? Because he's afraid. And when you're afraid or angry or abandoned, when you're lonely, when you feel like you're isolated for the way you're isolated so much from the ways of God. Here's what he said. Ahimelech, the king. Now this is a lie. The king sent me on a mission and said to me, No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. So he lies. So he says, the reason I'm here by myself, I'm on a secret mission. As for my men, I have men. But as for my men, I've told them to meet me at a certain place. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, meet me at a certain place. That was just so lame. You're on a desert. You can see the whole place. So he's just trying to cover for himself, and he didn't have any men, and he's afraid that if he tells the truth, Ahimelech isn't going to help him. And that lie could cost him, and it would cost. It didn't cost David. That lie would cost Ahimelech and his entire family their lives. The story continues. Now then, what do you have in your hand? What do you have on hand, he says. He says, give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can. Can you go find me some nice Hawaiian rolls? That would be good. I like those. So here's now David without any food, and he's getting hungry, and Ahimelech's thinking, this is just weird. Hey, you're by yourself and you're hungry. Dude, you're the king's son-in-law. The captain of the bodyguard shows up without any food because he's on a secret mission from the king and his men are hiding somewhere. Huh? The priest responded like this. He said, but the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there's some consecrated bread here. Now let me explain real quick. Every Sabbath, the priest would bake fresh, very fresh bread, and they'd put it on the altar before the Lord. Now, I know this sounds strange to us, but that was their way of honoring God with fresh bread. Lo and behold, the next day they'd come back and God had not eaten the bread that day, so they would take the fresh bread, the day-old bread, and the priest would eat it. But it was still considered consecrated bread, which meant you had to be ceremonially clean to eat the bread. So Elimelech says, hey, David, we don't just have any normal food here, but because we're the high priest, we do have some consecrated bread, and if you want the consecrated bread, well, then you can have it. So the priest gave him that bread. So now David not only lied about why he's there, now he's lied in order to be fed, which if you were here last week, stay with me. Remember last week on the first part of this series? You have to begin to wonder what happened to, in you I put my trust. My hope is in you all day long. What happened to that guy, that version of David? That in God you are my refuge and I run to you in my time of trouble. What happened to that version of David? And then the story gets so intense and there's so much drama in this next part. And I'm really hoping that in this next drama of this moment, that maybe God would speak to you, if you're still with me. David asks Ahimelech, do you have a spear or a sword here? Okay, and this is when Ahimelech, he gets a big clue. He's like, okay, wait a minute. You're like the most famous warrior in the nation. You show up by yourself. You look like you haven't slept in days. You don't have any food. And you don't have a weapon? Really? Huh? Do you have like a sword or a spear or a sword here? I'm not particular. I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's message is so urgent. Right? Maybe he thought he couldn't get it through customs. I don't know. But now, this is when something so amazing happens. And this is kind of like where I need someone with some background music playing right now. This is when everyone kind of needs to feel this tense moment like it's out of a film because this is amazing. David, catch this. David is virtually transported back in time, mind-wise. David is virtually transported back to the very time, to the very event that God used to catapult him to fame. And this is a wake-up call moment. And this is the, oh my gosh. That's what that was. What am I thinking? Why am I thinking? What am I doing? Why am I even considering these options? In this, his moment, this was the moment when his eyes should have been open. Because he's asking for a spear, he's asking for a sword. And check this out. The priest replied, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine who you killed 7 years ago, the Philistine that you killed 7 years ago in the Valley of Elah. is here. Now, this is amazing. Can you imagine the drama? I need a sword. I need a spear. I need some kind of weapon. The only weapon that is here is the weapon that you used to behead the giant that day, that you became the David that we've come to know and love and fear. Now, the text tells us that when David beheaded Goliath, that he kept the sword as a souvenir. Who wouldn't? I would. I think it'd be great. All right? This is a giant sword. I guess it's two-handed. Giant sword. Right? And he put it in his tent. But later, out of gratitude to God, he takes the sword of Goliath and he dedicated it to God. He gave it to the priest. And basically, it's his way of saying, God, I recognize that I did not deliver myself with this weapon. You delivered me. So I want to give the weapon back to you as a reminder that I've been dependent on you. There was so much emotion in this, I would think. There was so much significance in the sword of Goliath. And suddenly, David is reminded of the afternoon. And he did the unthinkable. Can you imagine? That he brings out the sword. All of those memories come flooding back. Oh, I remember that sword. That afternoon, he wandered down into the valley of Elah. And all by himself, as a shepherd boy, with nothing but a sling. Thousands of men lined up on both sides. And he stood there in front of a giant. What happened to that clear-eyed, courageous, God-fearing shepherd boy? What happened? You know, the one who looked at the giant, that battle-hardened warrior, and said, you come to me with a spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And this day, are you taking notes, Goliath? This day I'm going to strike you down, and I'm going to take your head from you, and I'm going to feed all the carcasses of the host of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, so that the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And this assembly will know, and those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spirit that the Lord says, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into my hands. Bring it, baby. I added that last part. Okay. My question is, you got this liar right now lying to the... What happened to that kid? What happened to the boy that ran toward the danger when everyone else was running from it? What happened to the poet that wrote those famous words, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me? What happened to that kid? Huh? Where's that faith? Where's that confidence in God? And the answer is fear, anger, and loneliness. We know this. These three giants have the potential, in your notes, to cause us to all forget the defeated giants in our past. These three giants have the potential to undermine our faith in God based on what God has done in the past. But David gets this extraordinary reminder. Do you remember? Hey, you remember the trinket? You remember this? David is shown as a visual aid to remind him of God's faithfulness and God's power. But he misses it. The priest replied, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. And it's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod, which was a garment worn by the priests as they did their priestly duties. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one. So he brings out the sword. Can you imagine all the memories, all the drama? And surely Ahimelech is thinking, none of this makes sense. None of it makes sense to me. And this would be a decision that David would regret for the rest of his life. And it would become, like all our decisions do, it becomes a permanent part of the story of his life. And he said to David, give it to me. David said that. He said, give it to me. There's none like it. Give it to me. And David takes matters literally in his own hands. He lies, then he runs away from crazy King Saul, and then he gets this amazing thing. And it's amazing to me what happens is that with the sword, the last time he had that, it was wielded by a warrior who was defeated by a 15-year-old boy. He should have seen it. He should have seen it coming. He should have remembered. Because it was just too much to miss. A flawed weapon, that's what it was. A flawed response with us. And we're about to see a disastrous outcome. But this is where our stories, your story and my story, this is where they intersect with David, isn't it? Because we are there, right? Right? When we need God the most, oftentimes we're least apt to lean into His direction when we need Him the most. When we need God the most, we are oftentimes tempted to run away rather than run toward. Fact. We opt for the things that never worked before and didn't get us where we are, and it often leads to regret. And so, I think it's interesting, I really do, because you've seen this in other people, haven't you? Answer me, have you seen this in other people? Yeah. They get in trouble. You see this in other people so easily. You have friends right now that are making terrible decisions based on fear, based on anger, and based on feeling abandoned. And you see it in them, and you're thinking to yourself, you're just going to make it more complicated. You're just going to create more regret, right? And it's so easy to see in other people, yet it's almost impossible to see in the mirror. Why? Because you know what you've done? You've convinced yourself, like I've convinced myself, that my situation is different. My situation is different. You don't understand. That's what David thought. Well, here's what David thought. He thought what we think. If God were with me, if God were really with me, this wouldn't be happening to me. If God were really with me, this wouldn't be happening to me. And here's one of the things that I've learned throughout the years as a Christian, as a Jesus follower. Here's something that perhaps you've all experienced, and maybe you just haven't put the words to it, and it's so easy. Watch. It's so easy to trust God when we have nothing to trust Him with and nothing to trust Him for. I'll explain. It's so easy in the early days when there's nothing to trust God with. You know, when you're young and you say, God, I want to know your will for my life. I'll do whatever you want to do. I'll surrender my life. And you go to kids camp or something like that, and then you come forward, and then you go to church, and you go around a campfire with a bunch of kids, you throw your stick in the fire saying, this is my sin, and you write a letter to God, and you get that first Bible, and it's like, God, I want to give you my whole life. And God's going, well, that's not a lot to give. You don't have a lot going on. You're just a kid, to be honest with you. Okay. And if you've got some stuff in your room, and you're not even in your car, so you don't have that much to give. But yeah, I'll take it. God, I surrender my life. Hello, God, I surrender my life to you. And you're like 12 or you're 15 years old. Okay, I'll take it. But at that point, honestly, it's easy to trust God when we have very little to trust Him with and nothing to trust Him for. That's when things are going great. How difficult is it to sing these songs when things are going great? Oh, it's easy. How difficult is it to show up and serve when things are going great? How difficult is it to pray when things are going great? How difficult is it to trust God and pray for your friends that are going through difficult times? It's easy to trust God when we have nothing to trust Him with and nothing to trust Him for. But it is harder when we trust Him with the things that we value and they start to slip away. Watch it. Watch it. I feel Brian's strength coming up inside of me. That's what happens. So David takes Goliath's sword. And then, just to show you where this goes, again, it's very easy to be critical of David, but we all have our own versions of this personally. Get this. David takes Goliath's sword, and he knows he has to leave the country, and guess where he goes? He goes to the land of the Philistines. That's a good move. Yeah. And he shows up in the land of the Philistines with Goliath's sword. Hello. So not only that, it gets worse. He goes to the city of Gath. Do you know who was from Gath? Goliath. Huh? You're not thinking too swift right now. And David, that's why I believe this actually happened, because nobody could make this stuff up. It's so ridiculous. But he's panicking, and he's afraid. And so he goes to the Philistines, and he goes to the king of the Philistines, the leader at that time, whatever it was. And he says, I want to join your army. I want to fight for your people against my people. But they're not buying it. And they're like, there's no way. No, David, because you are David. And everybody knows who you are. You slew Goliath. And don't tell us that you're not, because you're carrying his sword. And David becomes really afraid now, because he's surrounded by the enemy. So what does he do? He pretends like he's insane. Literally, he starts scratching with his nails on wood, and he starts slobbering and lets drool run all over his beard. Right? You should read the Bible. All this is in the Bible. And he starts slobbering all over himself. And the king's like, okay, I got enough fools in my court. I don't need this guy. Get this guy out of here. So David flees the Philistines, and he goes. And I mean, this is David. He's 22 years old. And he goes and he lives in a cave because he doesn't know what to do. He feels abandoned. He feels angry. And I mean, he knows he doesn't deserve this. And he's alone. And finally, maybe this is your moment. Finally, he comes to his senses. And he goes back to his country. And he finds another prophet. And he says, I have really messed up. I want to know what God's will is for me. I don't know the Lord's will. Would you seek the Lord on my behalf? Would you give me and provide for me the counsel of God? But the problem is, the damage is done. When David was with Ahimelech, looking for the bread and for the weapon, there was someone else there whose name was Doeg. And if you misspell it, it's Doug. All right? But Doeg was there. And Doeg was actually the chief herdsman for King Saul. All right? And he saw David there, and he overheard the conversation, and he got it wrong. He got just enough information to be confused enough to make things look really bad for Ahimelech. And he goes to King Saul, and he says, King Saul, I've located David. You know, you wanted someone to find him. I know where he is. So he went to Ahimelech. David did. He went there for advice, and I hate to be the one to tell you this, but the chief priest has sided with your enemy, David. Here's how the conversation went. Doeg tells King Saul, Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. That is, David showed up, and Ahimelech went to the Lord to get David advice for David. To get advice for David. So he also gave him provisions, and King Saul, I hate to tell you this, he gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. In other words, look, he fed him, he armed your enemy, and well, the king is furious. And here's the text. The king says, King Saul sent for the priest Ahimelech. Go to Nob and bring him to me, and bring all of the men of his family who are with the priest at Nob. And they all came to the king, and the king said to them, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him? In other words, you're in on this too. Why have you sided against me? My son's against me, my daughter's against me, my family's against me, and now the chief priest is against me? So that he has rebelled against me, and he lies in wait for me as he does today. And Ahimelech is like, wait a minute, what's going on? Ahimelech answered, who of all your servants is as loyal as David? It's like, what are you talking about? David isn't in rebellion against you. His reputation in the community is David is your most loyal subject. Who in your kingdom is more loyal? And as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, the captain of the king's bodyguard? I mean, you've entrusted this man with your life. Everybody knows how loyal he is to you, and he's highly respected in your household. And he says, besides that, this isn't the first time he's come to me for advice. Was that day the first day I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family. I don't know anything about this, for your servant knows nothing about this whole affair. But the king said, you will surely die. Ahimelech, you and your whole family, because he's crazy, and he's afraid, and he's paranoid. And then the king did something really foolish. What happened was, then the king ordered the guards at his side to turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too had sided with David. But the soldiers, the warriors that traveled with King Saul, they refused to kill the priests. I mean, we'll kill your enemies. We will do that. And we'll kill the prisoners of war. And we'll kill those that have robbed and stolen from our people. But we're not going to kill the priest of the Lord. But Doeg, remember Doeg, that chief herdsman? He thinks this is an opportunity for him to get in good with the king. And he raises his hand and he says, well, if they won't, I will. And Doeg slaughters 85 priests. This is bad, but I want you to see where it began. Saul isn't finished. He said, now I want all of you to go to Nob and I want you to kill every man, every woman, every child, every infant. Very few people escaped the slaughter. One of them was Ahimelech's son. And he flees to David. Get this. Look how it goes full circle. He flees to David, and he falls down at his feet, and he tells David the whole story. And can you imagine how David is broken because of this? And the text says this. He said, David talking, I am responsible for the death of your entire family. David was responsible for the death of the entire village, because taking matters into his own hands sometimes feels good. It just doesn't turn out good. Now, we're going to pick up the rest of the story next time, but I want to ask you 2 or 3 questions real quick as we think about how this intersects with our lives. Because for some of you, honestly, you're thinking, did someone call you and tell you to preach this sermon today? Okay, this is unbelievable. And the answer is yes, they did. They called me and they said, so-and-so is going to be here. Can you preach right at them? No, that's not what happens. No. This is common to all of us, and it is. This just is going to be our time in all of our lives when anger pushes us to do things that we shouldn't do, and there's a sense of isolation and loneliness, and we're suddenly fantasizing about things that we would tell other people that have no business doing that, because they become live options for us. Because these become emotions that are so powerful. So here's the question. What? What is your loneliness, anger, or fear causing you to consider that you never would have considered before? Huh? Relationally, financially, physically, some sort of risk that you never would take before. Maybe the idea of re-embracing an old habit that you spent hours and hours or days or weeks or possibly years or thousands of dollars overcoming. Suddenly you find yourself embracing that habit. What is your loneliness, anger, or fear causing you to do that you've never considered before? Have you ever seen that actually work out for anybody? So how about this question? Who is your loneliness, anger, or fear causing you to consider that you never or shouldn't consider? You've never called him back, but you're thinking about calling him back now. You didn't return that call, but you're thinking about calling her back now. She's made it very obvious. He's made it very obvious that there's a potential for a relationship, and you've ignored it and ignored it. But because of what's going on at home, because of what's going on financially, because of what's going on in some other area in your life, and suddenly it's a live option. And you know you have no business doing that. And here's the wake-up question, all right? This is the wake-up question that David completely missed. And we kind of get it. He's 22 years old, and he's by himself. But this wake-up call question is one I hope that you will get. Who, besides you, do your considerations put at risk? Besides you. Besides you, do these options that were never options before, suddenly they're live options? Who do these options put at risk besides you? And I already know the answer to the question for you. The answer is the people you love the most and those people who love you the most. That's who it is. Some of you know that through personal experience with your family growing up, Dad's anger spun out of control, and you've been dealing with it ever since. Mom's depression or mom's sense of loneliness or abandonment just got out of control, and she's turned to other things, and now you're dealing with that ever since. Or a son and a daughter was like that. Who else is at risk? Whose else's future hangs in the balance of your personal decision to give in to the impulse caused by anger, abandonment, or fear? One last. What advice? What advice would you give to someone who is you? What would you tell yourself? And isn't it true when someone else, it's so clear when you think it's you, right? And you think you're the exception to the rule. Do you know that you're not an exception to the rule? You are a very unique person, but your experience is not unique. You're a very special person, but your experience is not special. You're a one-of-a-kind person, but your experience is not one of a kind. These are well-worn paths. That's why it's so easy to know what other people ought to do. Now, this is the interesting thing about this question, is that we know the advice that David would give us. Not the 22-year-old David, grown-up king, would later give this advice, and he'd journal it for us. And here's what he would write. He would say, the Lord, everyone say the Lord. Everyone say it again, the Lord. The Lord is our refuge for the oppressed. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. Not a chemical, not alcohol, not an affair, not another person, not a lot of debt, not a new car, not a new house, not a new toy, not something else that you can list. The Lord Himself is a refuge for the oppressed. A stronghold. Now, this is a word that we don't get to use much because we don't understand what strongholds are. A stronghold is a place that you would flee or run to in times of war. A stronghold in times of trouble. The place you run to, that God is the place you run to. And it's the relationship you run to when you feel oppressed, when there are times of trouble. David would tell us, David would say, I took refuge in my ability to overcome the outcomes. And do you know what happened? It was a disaster. He would write, to those who know your name, trust in you, Lord. You have never forsaken those who seek you. Isn't that wonderful? I thought I'd been forsaken. David would say that, but I was mistaken. I thought I had been forsaken, but this thought that it wouldn't be happening to me if God was with me, I felt forsaken. But now I look back and I realized I wasn't forsaken. God was with me. I felt forsaken, but I was mistaken. You know what He would tell you? He would say, don't make that mistake. Don't make that. You can make a lot of stupid decisions in your life, but don't make the decision to believe that God is not with you, that He's not for you, that He's not there cheering for you all the time. And then there's something for those of you that are skeptical about Christianity. You know, been there, done that. Just because there's someone that wants to buy you lunch or told you they want to meet some cutie, or you're going to have to watch because they're staying overnight with a friend or a family member and they watch all these silly preaching programs and you're still having trouble and you're sitting there with your arms crossed. And I just want you to consider this, if you're, and those watching online and on TV, this is so powerful. You ready? 1,000 years later, 1,000 years after this event, 1,000 years, David's most famous descendant, who was actually born in the city of David, would gaze into the eyes of some frightened, angry, and abandoned, overtaxed Israelites. And he would say this, come to me. He would put himself in the place of the Lord. And because remember, David said, the Lord is my stronghold and my refuge. Jesus says, come to me. He would put himself in the place of God. Instead of the Lord as a refuge, Jesus, 1,000 years later, would look into a group of people in that very same part of the world, and he would say, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke, my burden, my perspective, my worldview. Take my yoke on you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Because when you feel forsaken, you are mistaken. God is with you. That's what Jesus would say. That's what Jesus would tell us. He would say, don't run, don't run, don't run, don't run. When Ahimelech brought the sword of Goliath, that's when he should have remembered. He would say, don't move until you're led. That's good, isn't it? The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold for times of trouble. But it's even better than that. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. He is your stronghold in times of trouble. We sang, my Jesus, I love thee. Do you know that He is yours and you are His? Amen? All right. Well, let's bow our heads. That's a lot to take in. I miss my buddy Jerry today. He'd walk up to me after church and say, Pastor, you had a mouthful of words. I love the story of David. You're not alone, folks. You're not. Don't make the stupid decisions. Don't. Father, we thank you for the story of David. And we can run straight to you. We don't have to go to a priest. We don't have to go to a pastor, a teacher, anyone. We can go straight to you because you are our stronghold. Because there is a war going on right now, and it's a spiritual war. It's a battle. And it's a battle for the souls of everyone listening today. Jesus. The battle is already won. Would you have your way in our lives? Would you help us, Lord, to not make foolish decisions, to not move until we're led, and only led by your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. See you next week.